Bonsoir, good evening. Mon nom est Mélanie Deveau, je suis directrice de l'éducation et du mieux-être au Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal. Bienvenue ce soir pour notre programme d'activité, notre première conférence, notre conférence d'ouverture pour l'exposition Parallèle, une autre histoire du design. Alors ce soir, la conférence Anonymous No Longer, Women in Design, va être donnée par Jeannine Falino, que je vais vous présenter dans quelques minutes. Je vais vous donner quelques mots sur l'exposition qu'on ouvre tout juste. Alors, Parallèle, une autre histoire du design, c'est une exposition qui a été commissariée par ma collègue Jennifer Laurent, qui est conservatrice des arts décoratifs et du design au Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal. C'est une exposition aussi qui est organisée par le Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal, mais en collaboration, évidemment, avec le programme Stewart pour le design moderne, avec qui on a une relation de longue date. Une exposition qui rassemble 250 œuvres et objets qui datent du milieu du 19e siècle à nos jours et qui sont toutes réalisées par des femmes designers. And more importantly, a parallel, a history of women in design tells an... Did I... Going? Yeah, sorry about that. I'm revealing some punch. Sorry. More importantly, Parallel, a history of women in design tells an inclusive story about design. It obviously celebrates the talent of women designers. It traces the evolution of the status of crafts within the history of arts, and it also brings forward the influence of women's rights movement in design. Alors, c'est pas banal. Ces histoires vont être aussi évoquées en complément de l'exposition par une riche programmation culturelle. Alors, notamment une table ronde qui va accueillir à l'occasion de la Journée internationale du droit des femmes, le 8 mars, des designers d'ici, dont le travail est présenté dans l'exposition. Alors, Marie-Hélène Beaulieu, Aurélie Guillaume, Natacha Thorpe. Alors, ce sera le 8 mars. Une conférence aussi le 12 avril qui va être donnée par l'historienne de l'art Marie-Ève Marchand à propos du rôle identitaire porté par les objets de design. Et je vais saluer le travail de mon collègue Benoît Jaudoin qui a mis en place là, vraiment une super belle programmation. Puis je vous invite à consulter le calendrier culturel pour avoir les détails sur cette programmation. Conferences and conversation. There will be 3 online lunch conversation. It's a new format that we are using with some lunch conversation with some of the exhibition's leading designer, Laura Wee-Lack on March 24th, Taysha Carrington on March 31st, and Tanya Aguiniga on April 14th. Alors, quelques remerciements, vous les voyez aussi à l'écran, des partenaires qui soutiennent notre programme d'activité culturelle. Alors, bien sûr, la Fondation de la Chenelière comme grand mécène, mais aussi le soutien de la Terra Foundation for American Art, spécifiquement pour cette exposition, et des partenaires publics, vous les connaissez, le gouvernement du Québec, le Conseil des arts du Canada et le Conseil des arts de Montréal. Alors, maintenant, la conférence de ce soir, où je vous ai déjà révélé quelques images. Alors, Anonymous No Longer, Woman in Design, je crois un habile clin d'œil au travail de Myriam Shapiro, Anonymous Was a Woman, va mettre en valeur les réalisations marquantes des femmes designers qui sont dans l'exposition Parallèle, mais aussi de différents enjeux, difficultés qu'elles ont pu rencontrer au long de leur carrière. La conférence va être offerte en anglais. Il y a une période de questions à la fin et si vous avez des questions en français, elles pourront être traduites à ce moment-là. So tonight's speaker, Jeannine Falino, acted as an advisor to the exhibition. She is a curator and museum consultant specializing in craft, design, and culture. A prominent figure in the field, her wide-ranging projects explore virtually every age of American art. Formerly curator of American decorative arts and sculpture at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, she now works with private and institutional clients on exhibition, catalogs, and books. Notable projects include the major survey exhibition Crafting Modernism, Mid-Century American Art and Design, that was held at the Museum of Arts and Design in 2011, Gilded New York, Design, Fashion, and Society at the Museum of the City of New York in 2013, and more recently, Betty Cook, The Circle and the Line at the Walter Art Museum in 2021. Jeannine is a very passionate and generous speaker, so thank you so much for being here tonight with us. Jeannine.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to Benoit Jaudoin for your wonderful your invitation, the opportunity to speak, to be here in Montreal with all of you, and it's quite a big crowd. Delighted to see you all here in spite of the rain. I wanted to also thank Mary Daly Desmarais and the director, Stéphane Aquin, for inviting me to be a participant in the exhibition as a consultant. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on this subject, which has become more and more important to me over time. And in that context, I also wish to thank David Hanks, who is the curator of the Lillian and David M. Stewart Program for Modern Design. Since 2018, I have been working with David and his assistant, Angeline Dazé, in procuring new objects for their collection for building a body of material that will be visible on their new website, Designed by Women, which you can look up and find wonderful new material, and also for helping to procure objects that are bit by bit being transferred over to the Montreal Museum of Fine Art. And in fact, it was David whose idea to work on women in design got us started, and then the museum took that idea and is now putting it into this great show, Parall, which I hope you'll all have a chance to see if you have not enjoyed it already. And then last of all, I feel an important thank you is due to Jennifer Laurent, who is the curator for the exhibition and who is not well, who could not be with us at the opening and at this time, but she wrote a very fine essay, which is in the catalog, and it is a truly, truly excellent review of the whole period, the cycle, the evolution of this whole story of women in design, and it is worth your time. So thank you. Let's begin. So this lady is not American and she's not Canadian. She's Virginia Woolf. And she was the great British novelist who wrote the book A Room of One's Own, which is this great cry for a space to do your own thinking, working, and making. And she's actually the person who is the source of this term, anonymous was a woman. She spent some time in this book thinking about Shakespeare and running her fingers across the titles of books, excuse me, in her library, and thinking, where are the other women? Who wrote the other stories in Shakespeare's time? And she said, indeed, I would venture to guess that Anon, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. And indeed, it's true. Anonymous has been a very popular term in museums for a long, long time, and I can say I've used it myself without thinking very much about what that truly means. But in fact, it happens that it is often a woman who is behind that word. And so let's look for a minute at a few faces of the people who are represented in this exhibition. And I hope you'll appreciate that they really draw from a very wide spectrum of life. White women, women of color, indigenous women. We wanted this exhibition to really represent the full spectrum of humanity. And I think we have done a fine job of that. There's always more work to do, and that's a theme that I will never stop propounding. But for a moment, before we begin thinking about all of the aspects of the art that they've produced, sometimes people have questions about what does it mean when we talk about design or craft? What does it mean to talk about interiors or industrial design? And what I would say is that for a long time, all of these different aspects of the media arts have been in their own little buckets or silos. And that's because people like me often like to put things in boxes to keep them organized. But the fact is that there is a lot of cross-pollination that goes on across that spectrum. And the fact is that many crafts, particularly fiber arts, for instance, needlework, those have been traditionally considered the feminine arts, and they were often excluded. So this exhibition really seeks to just, open that conversation, to really break open those different buckets and let them all swim together. And I hope you will swim in them as well and enjoy and not worry too much over one versus the other. Although I will say that for the craftsperson, typically they design the object, they know what they're going to make, and they are generally in charge of the entire fabrication from beginning to end. Not all of them do that. Some of them have people who work with them. At the other end of the spectrum is, say, the industrial designer or the interior designer who have those ideas, who may draw them in some fashion, but then they have others execute. But that's a very long spectrum, and there's lots of creativity at every step of the way. So here I think you can see some of the names attached to these faces, but what I just love is the spirit that you find in them, and the fact that these women have now, some of them posthumously, but they are all enjoying their moment in the sun. And with exhibitions like these, and there will be more to follow for sure, more and more of these women will become household words. But there was a time when they weren't. And this is a famous photograph that we actually used in my mid-century modern exhibition at the Museum of Arts and Design. And it's a famous photograph. It was shown in Playboy, kind of interesting in that, just that alone. And so here we have the great mid-century designers from left to right. George Nelson, who headed a company with many designers, Ed Wormley, a famous furniture designer, Eero Saarinen, whose father helped to establish Cranbrook, and who is a great designer in his own right of airports and furniture, Harry Bertoia, and each one, by the way, is sitting in a chair of their own design. Sitting with the chair facing forward is Charles Eames, and then at the far right is Jens Rissem, who I had the pleasure of interviewing for the Archives of American Art years ago. So this is a great formal photograph, sort of artfully conceived, to talk about how these great men have done such great things. But they forgot a few things. For instance, George Nelson employed Lucia de Respinis as his designer, and her spindle clock is visible above their heads now, and it's found in the exhibition. Lucia was actually involved as long ago as the 1959 Moscow American Exposition. So she has been designing for a very long time. She's still with us. And I just love this photograph of her sort of looking backwards at these fellows with a perhaps not too salutary grin. And then on the far right, the lower right, is Ray Eames. And Ray was an integral part of the partnership of Charles and Ray Eames, furniture designers. They are known to all of us today, more or less, as Ray and Charles, because the last, I would say, 10 or 15 years has really raised her visibility in the public eye. But at the time that this photograph was taken, that was definitely not the case. And we will come back to them in a few minutes. But Ray is somebody, it's an interesting question. Ray never really raised her voice, at least in public. She seemed to be happy to defer to her husband. And we don't have anything from her in the written record that says what she really felt about this. how would you have felt if you were Ray Eames and credited privately by your husband as probably the brighter of the two of them? And yet she was content somehow to keep her mouth shut and step to the back of the room when her husband got all the attention. Now, this photograph is from 1961, and this fabulous, beautiful Corvette, the Fancy Free, is featured in the exhibition. I hope you've seen it. It's a glory to behold. And in fact, in 1958, or slightly before that, a group of women were hired by General Motors to actually make improvements to their line of automobiles. This is the one surviving example from that experiment. And there was this fellow at General Motors named Harvey Earl. It was his idea to hire these women from Pratt Institute. And he invited them to come design these interiors. A few of them actually designed kitchens. And all of this was with the purpose of realizing for the first time that women had the purse more often than people realized, that they were making purchases of cars, and they might want features that appeal to them. Smart thinking, right? So they hired these girls, these ladies, these women, these designers, and they produced what they were asked to do. And yet there was always this residual bias, and of course it was 1958, so I guess we can expect that. But she said, one of the women, Susan Vanderbilt, said, "What distressed us most was that we could never be identified as designers. We were always la femme, or the female designers, but as a designer, we designed the same things that men did. Why didn't we get the same treatment?" Well, they didn't. There was a femme auto show in 1958, and all these pieces were shown to great acclaim. And the year later, everything was closed up and put away, and not a thing was put into production. And this is the only surviving remnant from that era, from that episode. It's a troubling thing to see. You wish that more had happened. And yet, there were things that Ruth Glennie, who was the designer of this interior, that she did, and she introduced that became standard issue in cars around the world. One, a retractable seatbelt. Two, a lighted mirror to see yourself. Sometimes that does cause trouble when you drive, but in theory, you should do it only when the light is red. And what was the third one? I may have forgotten it. What was it? There was a third one. It'll come to me. But in any case, it shows a moment where women were being put forward, kind of like these fellows we just saw, but the results were not the same. It wasn't time yet. But women were getting a little angry. This is a famous poster, also in the exhibition, by a group of women known as the Guerrilla Girls. And their identities are still kind of hidden. And they were mostly art historians, I have to say, and a few artists. And they were just mad, really mad. Because here it was, 1985, and American museums were not doing a whole lot for women. And so they have this lovely nude portrait of a woman wearing the gorilla's head to keep their identities hidden. But their point was very obvious. What do you have to do to get into the Met? I guess you have to be a naked lady. This was the sad situation. And today, things aren't that much different. If you look today at a recent study that only came out in the last year, looking at 31 museums across the United States between 2008 and 2020, not much has improved. There were 50% women in the United States, and yet we're only 10% of the art. And if you're talking about Black Americans, there are 13.5%, and only 2%, almost 3%, say, are shown. And Black American women, well, the numbers are still lower. Now, we know that things have changed a lot, and there has been a real watershed of progress, but everybody worries. Is it just the latest novelty? Is it going to go away? We just don't know. And the fact is that we have so many years of male white dominance to overcome. After all, museums have been collecting for hundreds of years, and much of the art that they collect has been by white men. So it's going to take a long time to make those changes possible, and to also have gender and racial parity across the board. But this show is an important step in the right direction to redress that situation, and to just continue to bring attention to these rather dismal facts. But the fact is that there's been a lot going on, and I'm very proud of all of the activities that have been achieved, and also the great art historical research that has helped to unearth a lot of these contributions. The first of whom is the woman named Clara Driscoll. Clara was not a household word until a few years ago, when two art historians working independently found her letters to her family. She produced these so-called round-robin letters to her family. She would write her news, send it to one sister, who would send it to another, to another, to another, and they all ended up back with one family member. Those letters were discovered, and wonderful bits of information began to come out. So here we have Clara Driscoll with Joseph Briggs, who is her head workman. Clara Driscoll was a great designer, and Louis Comfort Tiffany was her employer. He valued her artistry so much that he made her head of the women's cutting department, the glass cutting department. He also was so impressed with her designs that he used them in his lamps. And this peacock lamp that you see at the right is by her. And there are others. And there are other women who worked for her with artistic talent, and their work was also used in these stained glass windows. That's not to say that their names were known at the time. And just as it is with many large corporations, the work of many of the artists and others working for them are not well known, if known at all. But because of the issues we're discussing here today, it's a wonderful piece of news that we could put a name to a drawing and say, a woman did that. And what's more, Mr. Tiffany really valued them. In fact, the men were planning to unionize against them. They didn't like the advances they were making, but Mr. Tiffany held firm, and the women stayed. And he liked Mrs. Driscoll so much that he even took her to Brittany on a sketching trip with some other artists. Very high praise for a woman working with him in the early 1900s. Now, she had problems like other women of her time. She was single when she was hired, and then she got married and she lost her job, because a woman is not allowed to work when she's married. After all, she has to take care of her husband. She married a second time, very briefly, and stepped off, returned, and then a third time, third time was the charm for her. She married a third time, and then she retired completely. But during her period there, which was a total of about maybe 18 years, she was a very productive and well-paid member of his company. So it's a terrific story. So now that we've set the stage a little bit, I'd like to start at the beginning, see where we are. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the indigenous people who are represented in the exhibition, and point out two of them to you. These are two women from the Southwest, and they are both considered kind of the mothers of the known Native Americans working in the modern era. And both of them are in the show. Nampeo is known for her very wide saucer-like vessels. while Serafina Tafoya has made these broader pieces that are really intended as water bottles, and they would have been carried on the head. They have a little concave section at the base of the vessel so that it would fit more comfortably, whereas Nampeyo's vessels might have been considered more like seed jars, more easily contained inside. But I think one has to realize that by 1900, most of the pieces that were being made were also done for tourist trade. It's almost certainly possible, although the Oya probably had more of a functional purpose. Up here in Canada, there are just innumerable women also doing marvelous things. And these two in the show, both from Micmac culture. The work on the left is by Mary Christiane Paul Morris, who is known for her porcupine quill work. And so this is a Western-style cradle. It's not the typical cradle board that we're used to thinking about with Native American art. But she has covered it with birch bark and then inserted porcupine quills in them to create this very dense pattern of beautiful design, which include images of a moose and stars and such. And then on the right, an unknown artist, again, probably a woman, almost certainly a woman in this case, produced this tea cozy. So it's not a hat, rather it's a hat for a teapot, and it's something that many of us have lost track of now that we have, microwaves and such. But in the old days, if you had a teapot and you wanted to keep the tea warm, you used a tea cozy. And this has fabulous embroidery on it. And so one can say, well, this might have been made for someone within the tribe, or it could have been made for tourist purposes. And that is probably the case here, in my opinion. Now, these Native American indigenous works that we were talking about here, they became very important to the early members of the arts and crafts movement because of the fact that they represent a pre-industrial world. And that is really the principle behind the arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement was valuing primarily the medieval world, the proto-Renaissance era, before a lot of great regulation was placed upon the arts, a time when architecture and sculpture became part of this big triad, and then the hand arts became part of the secondary status. And so the folks from the arts and crafts movement, John Ruskin and William Morris, for instance, they really valued the work being produced in this time. And you'll find articles on them in periodicals of the period, like The Craftsman, which was an American publication. May Morris, who was the daughter of William Morris, was an embroiderer, and she was also a jeweler. And she always lived under the shadow of her father because his reputation was so broad. He was a printmaker, he was a book publisher, he produced tapestries, and he designed furniture, and he published very, very widely. But May was every bit his equal in the craft department, and she was a phenomenal jeweler, as you can see here. She also produced outstanding needlework, and only recently was a major retrospective of her life mounted in England. So it's only taken her, 120 years to get respect. But we knew about her. And so she is included in the exhibition as somebody who is kind of like a mother figure, perhaps, to those of us on this side of the pond. And I'll only add here that one of the features of the arts and crafts movement was to prefer colors and design over important rare materials or costly items like cut gems, for instance, or gold. Instead, she's choosing silver here, and she has cabochons of garnets and williamsite, a not very expensive colored stone. So the idea was to create a color portrait in jewels. In terms of pottery, women were very active in the field. And one example on the right is by a Canadian artist named Alice Mary Egan Hagen. And Alice apparently was very influential in her day. And she followed a format that I think a lot of women do. And that is, when you don't know what you're doing, you just keep trying and trying until you figure it out. So she says, when you have no written guide or teacher, you just go to work and try one thing after another. And until you find out for yourself. After all, what would our world have today if we never tried anything new? That's the spirit that a lot of women have brought to the field and have made such a difference in the kind of works they have brought to us. And Alice had a very different approach to China painting than others. She's working with probably a blank in this case, and then she was a China painter, so she painted the decoration on top in a way that I've never seen by anyone, a kind of a distilled Art Nouveau kind of an approach, but almost hallucinogenic in its explosion of color and design. A really beautiful piece to see with lots of luster glaze, so it's a brilliant piece to enjoy. On the left, a totally different approach. The Saturday Evening Girls were a group that formed in Boston, in the north end of Boston, where lots of immigrant groups were established. And two women came together to form this group to help these immigrant girls have a life, to assimilate into American culture, and to find a means of supporting themselves. And so this group first began meeting on Saturday evenings, hence the name. And then they named themselves Paul Revere Pottery, since that part of town is exactly where Paul Revere's shop was located. And they produced, for decades, a series of vessels, lots of children's dishes, fairly affordable, and in such a way that they were able to continue working through the 1940s. But fortunately for them, they also had a female as a philanthropist friend, and she was the one who really helped to support the group throughout their long existence. Sisterhood is powerful. The same is true here. In Deerfield, Massachusetts, there was a lot of interest in the arts and crafts, and women came together to form the Deerfield Blue and White Society, so called because of the colonial needlework that many of them enjoyed and found in each other's attics through, the centuries, things being left behind by grandmothers and grandfathers. They began to catalog them, they began to copy them, they learned needlework techniques, and then they branched out into things like this that you see on the left in a very Japanesque fashion. So we see some dragonflies hovering around seaweeds in this very sort of flat Japanesque design. And also in Deerfield was Madeline Yale Wynn, a woman who was a writer, a painter, a metalsmith, and a jeweler, and her work was called barbaric, but in a positive way. Madeline was constantly experimenting, and she was one of the mainstays of the community in Deerfield, which did have a lot of women also doing photography and basketry, among other things. Female solidarity also was very important in 1893 for the World Columbian Exposition, which took place in Chicago. For the first time, there was a women's building, and this book was designed by Maud Howe Elliott to celebrate all of the activities that took place at the fair. So you could have bought this if you went to the fair, or you could have bought it anywhere if you were thinking about going to the fair or learning about all the different women who were active there. So it's a great testimony to that effort. And it was also a wonderful era for book illustration and book designs, and many women were able to make their way and make a living in that fashion. And that was the case for Angel Decora Dietz, who was a Winnebago artist and invited to create this book design for a book on Indian music, an Indian music book written by a woman musicologist, ethnomusicologist, and she based her own design on a Native American parfleche, which is kind of like an envelope that is carried, and she based it upon the work of another woman, Native American whose work she respected. So there's this wonderful echoing back and forth between these women and these cultures, and then brought out for what was probably a primarily Anglo culture. The Montreal Society of Arts and Crafts was active, and I would love to know more about what was happening at that time. But this wonderful dress is in the exhibition, and it has some marvelous chenille embroidery that you can see here up close. And on the right is the work of Candace Wheeler, who founded the Associated Artists, a group of women embroiderers who came together to work for various wealthy Gilded Age families. What you're looking at here is probably a portiere, which would have hung between rooms and doorways. And here she's using kind of a Japanesque design of these chrysanthemums seemingly floating on the air or in water. Sometimes we wonder where people get their ideas, and the unknown Ojibwe woman who created this jinkle dress and headband must have been looking at American or Canadian fashion magazines. She took this traditional form of dress using beads and jingles, which would have come from old tobacco tins that would have been cut and curled amongst other kinds of discarded metal objects. They were often used in all kinds of dress. She took these materials and she used them to fashion a kind of a flapper era dress. These dresses would have been used, they would have been worn, the music would have been used to help call upon a spirit. The people who danced in these dresses were supposed to dress and dance to help guide a journey as they danced. But yet this woman not only had native traditions on her mind, but she was thinking of things she'd seen elsewhere. And it's a marvelous hybrid of the kind of inspiration that can come to women wherever they are. And then on the left, Ida Desmarais, she was a Montreal artist who was very well known in her time. She had as many as 40 seamstresses working with her. So these two dresses are shown side by side, and it's interesting to see how they would they're both dressing their very best for their own people. Now, there were African Americans who were also designing, and some of those names have only come to us in recent years. In particular, Anna Russell Jones, who was I feel I know her now. She was such an engaging person. She's one of the first African Americans, I should say, to graduate from the Philadelphia School of Design for Women, which today is known as the Moore College of Art. But she was one of the very first to graduate, and she had a career designing wallpaper, and rugs for clients. She also became a WAC and she did illustration for the U.S. Army. She became a practical nurse. She seemed to go from one great career to another, but this is the very beginning that we see here, and she was a very engaging person, and she ended up with many, many awards at the end of her life. Much better known is Lois Mailou Jones, a Boston-born artist who became a very well-known painter. But for artists who are trying to make a living, and we know artists often have their difficulties, she also produced wallpaper designs for many firms in New York, including Schumacher, which was still a very great firm. So here we see her textile design that has been called African Idol, with brilliant color and different figures, but also lots of lush tropical plantings. Now, as World War I ended, and the new era began in the 20s, like as we've just seen with these two women that we just saw, Anna Carolyn Jones and Lois Mailou Jones. there was a new emphasis on professionalism. And one of those professions was interior design. The other had to do with industrial design. And women, in part because of the war, because of their time often spent without the company of men, they found themselves needed in the workforce. Their confidence grew, their abilities grew, their employability grew. It seems that more and more women were entering the profession and making the most of it. One of those women was Elsie de Wolfe, whose famous book was The House in Good Taste, which has gone through about 10 or 12 printings over the years. Elsie was actually intending to be an actress, not quite reaching the top of the heap, so she moved on and got involved in interior design at the suggestion of her lifelong companion, Elizabeth Marbury. The two of them lived together as a couple, and they did so largely in the public eye, which is important to respect and acknowledge looking back after all these years. She was a very prominent figure. She lived openly with Elizabeth, and it was thanks to Elizabeth, who saw her talents in design, who said, "Why don't you try this out?" She produced the book, she got lots of clients, and she had impressive social skills, so she was able to really climb the ranks. She produced designs for Henry Clay Frick. She even encouraged him to make purchases of art. Very influential. And so confident in her abilities and her person that here she is at the age of 70, being photographed as an ingenue. I swear, if you didn't get close, you'd think she was 18 years old. But she's also shown in the environment that she loves, and that is one of restraint and light and grace, in her opinion. This was the kind of designs that she was best known for. She tended to favor a kind of light 18th century French style, but filtered through this more stripped down kind of an interior. In Montreal, other women found interest in the professions and pursued them. This is the work of Jeannette Munier-Bieler. Her desk is on view in the exhibition, and at the right is a photograph of the same desk at home when she was living with her husband, André, who was also a very well-known artist. It is interesting to note that her husband was really interested in paintings of rustic Canadian life. And when they married, she made him get rid of a lot of them or put them somewhere else. But I think there's one hanging above the table. And that was sort of their compromise. But, where did she get the idea for these tubular tables? Clearly, she was looking at Bauhaus designs. There was an Austrian publication called Décoratifs. She probably saw that. There were various ways the information crossed the Atlantic, but apparently she had to engage somebody in the aircraft industry to actually fabricate this design. So it's a wonderful survival, and I bet there are wonderful stories to be learned about the things that she saw and learned. Also interesting to me is someone I had not really known until this exhibition. Elizabeth Eyre was a Pennsylvania woman. Her uncle was a well-known Philadelphia architect, and she spent most of her life in Europe, at least her productive artistic life. She was voracious sexually, I hear, and she spent a lot of time designing, mostly with women. And she's seen here wearing a coat that was designed by the great designer Sonia Delaunay. This is undoubtedly a brilliantly colored coat. We just can't tell from this black and white picture. And Elizabeth had a really imaginative sense of design, and she produced this balancelle bed, which is more like a swing because it's literally hanging. It could be placed on a deep porch, but it could also be in your house if you're so inclined. And it's a marvelous thing. You can access it from two sides, and it's completely unexpected. And that's the kind of work that I think really is so great to discover and to bring forward. It happens that her productive artistic life was fairly short. She then turned to writing articles, and when she died in New York many decades later, she was really quite unknown and in difficult straits. So we're fortunate that this sort of thing has survived. Women designers got very busy in the 30s, and some of them came to us only because we found their names in the US patent records, as is the case for Elsa Tenhart, whose cocktail set is on the far right. This is a wonderful thing that is focused on these triangles and diamond shapes, which she was really, really fond of. Belle Kogan learned how to run a business by helping her dad in his jewelry store in New York City, and she became a great designer. She knew how to run a business, and she had at least a 60-year-long career. This beginning at the very beginning of her career in the 1930s, and working in silver plate, less expensive, more attractive to Depression-era families who want to get something very modern. And then on the left, Ilanka Karaz was a Hungarian-born designer who came with her sister to the U.S., and the two of them had unbelievably productive lives. And I find this choice of the chair by Ilanka a wonderful one because it really has a kind of folk quality. It has this rigorous modernism, really strict kind of modernism. But at the same time, if you look at it, I think you can see it has these echoes of a folk peasant furniture. It's so absolutely simple. So just wonderful things, and proving that women can accomplish these things for themselves, find these careers, and have long-lasting ones. But for a lot of women, that wasn't the case. They were still stuck at home. They were unhappy. They couldn't even put their finger on what the problem really was. And I wanted to give you a small quotation from Betty Friedan, who helped to put her finger on the problem. So here she says, "The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning, that is to say, a longing that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds and shopped for groceries, she was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is that all there is?" Yes, is that all there is? But this was a time, 1963, birth control was becoming available. This is also the second post-war period after World War II. More women had entered the workforce because of the war while the men were away. More women finding reason to stake a career for themselves. And so this sort of marked a new move forward, and more women were entering the workforce, or just simply establishing their own studios as artists. Two women, both from Sweden, landed on our shores. I'll start on the right with Sigrun Bülow Hube, who was born in Sweden, very interested in housing issues, and she came to the U.S. to study a little bit, and then to Montreal to work for a firm that I'm sure you all know called T. Eaton. And she was not very happy with them. So she began to design her own things. She formed her own company called AKA, and this chair is a wonderful survival. Kind of this organic modernist style that others had also been working in, and with webbing that may have been left over from the war. That's just a guess, only because I know of other designers who did similar things. On the left here, we have a design for a desk by Greta Magnuson Grossman. This desk was made by Glenn of California, a big furniture designer. But Greta was trained as an architect and as a furniture maker, and she was accomplished in both before she fled Sweden just before World War II. She established herself in Los Angeles, on Rodeo Drive, no less, And from there, she was able to design a number of homes, including those for Greta Garbo and Bergman, the filmmaker. But her furniture has survived and done quite well. In fact, women were getting very active in design. You've already been introduced to Lucia de Respinis. Florence Knoll is the female side of Knoll and Company, the great furniture designer. And what people don't really realize is that Hans Knoll died at the very beginning of the partnership. He died young, he died early, and it was Florence Knoll who really led the company. And she was also designing like a woman, thoughtfully. And this oval table desk kind of represents her thinking on the subject of holding meetings. If you're holding a meeting with a square desk, people are at odds and ends. Where do you put them? If you have an oval table, people can gather around. There's community. Those are the kind of things that she brought to her sense of design. And then on the far right, Greta von Nessen, part of the von Nessen design family in New York, produced this marvelous Anywhere lamp. And again, thinking very creatively, it's called the Anywhere lamp because guess what? You can use it just about anywhere. You can use that loopy part that's on the base and use it and hang something on the wall. You can also turn the lamp head upside down or sideways so that it can be positioned in about 3 different fashions. So predictably inventive, I would say, is something you could say about a lot of women designers. Fabric turned out to be a very popular area of production. And I know I'm going to run out of time soon, so I should probably rush. But Anir Oshituk is a Cape Dorset artist who is busy with lots of screen-printed designs. So these are actually one-offs, and I would compare them to others like, say, the one by Dorothy Liebes on the far right, which uses Lurex, a plastic shiny material produced by DuPont, and she became a kind of an industry representative for that company. I'll just say another word about Charles and Ray Eames. This is just the sense of fun that you get here. I hope you can see that these staples, so-called, are really just parts of the furniture that they designed. But this is really, I'm sure, evidence of Ray's sense of humor, because that was often what distinguished the two of them. But Charles had his own one-man show at MoMA in 1946, and his wife was only mentioned as his helpmeet. With the 60s, studio craft becomes very big, and your own Mariette Rousseau-Vermette produced some major pieces. This has been just restored, and it looks fabulous in the galleries. She was really well respected for thinking about color in this sort of intense kind of a fashion, almost like a Rothko painting. She often folded and pleated her pieces to give them more dimension. And on the right, Sheila Hicks was not even weaving in pieces like these. She was just wrapping these bits of fabric and then folding them to create all kinds of new forms that you would never have imagined with fiber. By the 70s, there was this whole new interest in women and feminism, and Woman House catalog is one that really crystallized that moment. In Los Angeles, a group of women came together, including Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, who are seen here, and others, and they produced a whole house that had themes based upon women artists, one of them including a dollhouse, where things that don't usually happen in dollhouses were meant to happen. And so they were sort of turning the tables, using their own materials to make statements about life as a woman. Some women were involved in the pattern and decoration movement, which finally brought decoration out of the shadows. After years of suffering under minimalism, women began to say, the heck with that. I'm going to use all the tools at my disposal, the whole quilting world, the subversive stitch, as they call it. Take all those wonderful feminine techniques and skills and apply them to your own purposes. So Jane Kaufman, one of these women, is using beads and feathers, very unminimalist, let's say it, you know, loud and proud. And Joyce Kozlov went to to North Africa. She was transported by all of the great tiles that she saw, and came back and began to make tiles furiously and patterned them and decorated them, and a whole new movement was born, pattern and decoration. For other women, it was really to express African-American life, and Faith Ringgold, who just had a major retrospective at the New Museum, has this magnificent piece that's on view now, which is really a memory of her childhood called Tar Beach. It's remembrance of life on the roof in Harlem in the summertime, in the days before air conditioning. So she's lying there, her parents are chatting, and the stars are above. She's produced this in a variety of ways, but she's using framing mechanisms, paint, silkscreen, to make it all come to life. And more recently, the work of Carolyn Mazlumi has come into focus. Carolyn has been doing amazing work, bringing forward the work of African-American women quilters and doing quilting herself. But she was trained as an aerospace engineer. An amazing woman who I have not yet had the pleasure to meet, but her Lady Sings the Blues is here, and it's all in 3 dimensions. So, you know, women celebrating women is also a great part of this story. Another couple where recognition has been long sought and not entirely received was the couple Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, long known as great architects. They produced this very fun chair called Queen Anne chair, grandmother's tablecloth design. Well, it's one of many things they did. Her husband received the Pritzker Prize in 1991, and she was never acknowledged. There have been 22,000 names on a petition to have that changed, and still the Pritzker Prize goes to Robert Venturi. One hopes that will change with time. In silver, there are all kinds of things still happening. Metalsmithing is still a vibrant and live profession, and Myra Mimlich Gray is one of the best American designers doing it today, anywhere, as far as I'm concerned. And one thing she does is she interrogates the whole process of metalsmithing. And so in this case, she's taking on the concept of melting as a process. Is it melted? No, it's not melted. It's completely hand-formed, hand-hammered. And so she likes to play with those kinds of expectations. And at the totally opposite end of the spectrum, Leila Vignelli produces this wonderful carafe in a very seamless and modern design. For Native American artists in the Southwest, pottery continues to be a very, very strong part of their culture, and women have been doing extremely well. And in fact, the generational pull of all of this has been very strong. So Dextra Kwotskuya is actually like a 4th-generation descendant of Nampeo, and she continues to carry on the tradition with pottery today. I have about 5 more. Thank you. Running over, sorry. Sonia Clark has been doing remarkable things, and this is just one of many I could talk about. But what she does primarily is explore herself, her identity as an African-American woman, and as a Black woman with curly hair. She has exploited that in many, many of her works, among other things. And this object, which is in the museum's collection, is a playful approach to that. instead of using hair, she's using the old-fashioned metal hair curlers that's spraying out of that cap in a very playful fashion, and she's added little embroidered pieces on the top. So it's a celebration where women of color had to always hide their hair, use all kinds of oils and such to straighten things out. Here she's saying, I'm loud and I'm proud, and I'm the same way, actually. So I think I say more power to her. We're really thrilled to have so many wonderful Black artists represented in the exhibition. And among them is, I think, the youngest artist in the show, Taisha Carrington, whose wonderful hair bun piece, as she calls it, actually includes her own hair, but dyed yellow, in a way to entice the visitor to come, get closer, and then realize, oh, this is an African-American woman's hair. So a surprise, little surprise there. And Sheila Bridges, who also likes to play with surprise, here she's using a typical toile de jouy pattern, these gentility kinds of patterns of beautiful people walking and playing, by the Arc de Triomphe. Instead, she inserts African-American people dancing and playing. And these have become so popular that Wedgwood now has a line of her designs. For two women of different generations, I have to say these two pieces are among my favorites in the exhibition. Wendy Maruyama on the right has produced this really a cabinet with personality is, I think, the best thing one can say. She flourished at a time when men were basically the only people working in the carpentry shops. And she was one of the first people to finish a furniture program in a whole class of men. And she chose not to honor the beauty of the wood in the old-fashioned way. She started playing with color and sculpture and even neon. So that is the kind of attitude that Wendy has brought to the field. Meanwhile, Simone Lee, who just recently had her own show at the Venice Biennale, was 20 years ago making pieces like these, works that relate to the human body, to relate to fruit, to vegetables, to fecundity. These are fabulous, meaningful works that really draw on our collective humanity and deserve so much more attention. I'm going to just jump a little bit. Sorry. I'm sorry. What I will, just a couple left, just a couple. One of the things that women, I think, have been especially attuned to in recent years is the fact that climate change affects us all. And I've been really gratified to find the work of so many women who are really making a difference in that regard. So Amber Cowan has been collecting all kinds of old glass, old milk glass in this case, what she calls a basin in milk, is the milk glass your grandmother used to have. She takes it all and she heats it up with a torch and applies little tools to it to change their appearance, and then heats them until a hole. She's been doing marvelous and inventive work. And on the right is Suzanne Tick, a very renowned designer of fabrics for Knoll and others, now on her own firm. But she has been also really, really interested in this subject. And what you're seeing here are two big, massive walls of clothing hangers that have been curled and attached to the wall. So go to the exhibition and see that. And for bioleather is with us, people. We are going places. We're going to leave the cows behind if Theanne Skiros has her way with us. This is a test designed for sneakers. Everything is made of bioleather, and the shoes are made by a woman as well. This microbial bioleather is really the future, and we're going to be hearing more from her. But for those who find all these things around us and can't get rid of it, we have Jae Sung Oh. Jae has taken objects from her world around her. There's a I think there's a little horse that you can rock on. There's a little post office box. There's a chair. She's taken them all together and wrapped them with jute and turned them into something totally different. So there is a future for consumables if you're somebody like Jay. So lastly, I'll just say that we have seen so much. We have been so lucky to find women who have had the spirit to persevere. Women who have had great mentors from other women and men. Men have played a great role in this, there's no question. But it's clear that we have a long way to go. We still have not achieved parity in pay, and museums have a long way to go in terms of bringing more women and women of color into collections. And so the change is with us. We're riding a great wave at the moment, but we're not finished. And I hope that each of you will think of that and, in your own way, help that progress along. Thank you.